Hey there everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming at you with some more writing advice, this time about imagery. Specifically, imagery when it comes to setting. Now, I'm gonna admit something to you. Imagery is not my strong suit when it comes to writing. Never has been, probably never will be. But because of these tips and tricks that I'm about to share with you today, I have gotten better at imagery. Like before, I would completely just leave it out of my stories. I was very much a dialogue and action person, and I would just honestly forget to describe the settings and locations that my stories were taking place in. But then I got my degree in fiction writing from Columbia College Chicago, and the teachers there are really amazing, and they taught me these tips and tricks that I'm about to share with you to write better imagery. So yeah, writing imagery still doesn't really come naturally to me per se, but by using these tips and tricks and by really focusing on including imagery in my stories, I'm able to create really dynamic settings in my books. And so today we are going to be focusing on the 5 senses. And I know you're probably thinking, yeah, duh, Leighton, when you are working with imagery, you're gonna have to use the 5 senses, but you would be surprised at how many writers begin and end with sight and just ignore all of the other senses. Because let's be real, it's not that difficult to visualize a location in your mind and then transfer that onto the page. Like, that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. What is hard is creating a dynamic location, creating a setting that readers can then really visualize in their own heads and like feel like they are there. But first we are going to start with sight because, like I said, that is the easiest. But there are things that you do still need to think about when it comes to sight. So first things first, when it comes to sight, like I said, it's easy to visualize a location and then write it out. But what you don't need to do, and in fact what you shouldn't do, is write down every little minute detail about this location that you are creating. I know that it's very tempting to do so because in a way that feels like good imagery. You feel like, I am really painting the picture of this place in the reader's mind. Like, they can see exactly where that desk is located in the room, and the bed, and like what's on the bed, and what's on the desk, and what's in the dresser, and it feels like that's great imagery, but it's honestly not. It's kind of like writing character descriptions, which I talked about in my 10 newbie writer mistakes video, which I will link up there in the cards. In the video, I talked about how you don't have to do a head-to-toe profile of a character to describe them. You need to pick out key characteristics that will A, help the reader envision them, but also B, tell the reader some things about this character. And it's the same thing when it comes to describing a room or other type of location. You need to give a few key characteristics of the location to help the reader envision it, and then you also need to give some characteristics that help the reader to understand more about the person or people who inhabit this space. So for example, when I was at Columbia College Chicago, I was in a writing workshop and it was my senior year, and I knew that imagery was something that I was struggling with. So I wrote a scene where I described this character's bedroom, and I did just what I told you not to do. I wrote out every little minute detail about this kid's bedroom because I thought, I finally get it. I'm finally writing good imagery. And I brought the scene in and I read it aloud to my workshop, and then they did this thing called recall. And so basically what they were doing is they were saying what they remember from what I read aloud. And so at the end of that class, my teacher pulled me aside and he said, "Hey Leighton, I see that you were really trying to work on your imagery. That's great. Did you notice what your classmates recalled?" And I had noticed. They mentioned kind of the big sweeping stuff. You know, they didn't remember where the bed was located in the bedroom or where the closet was located. What they remembered were the things that characterized the bedroom and the teen boy who lived in the bedroom. They remembered the hand-painted constellation on the wall. They remembered the curtains that were constantly drawn so that light wouldn't come in. They remembered the books on astrophysics on the bookshelves. Everything that told them about who my character was, which was like somebody who was obsessed with outer space. And so my teacher told me, those things that your classmates recalled are the things that need to stay, and everything else, or almost everything else, can go. And I was like, my dude, I worked so hard to include all of that detail, and now you want me to cut it? And I was so upset for like a day. And then I went back and I looked at the scene and I cut all of that, and wouldn't you know it, it made the imagery that much better. And then in the long run, I actually ended up adding in a few more things that made the room even more dynamic imagery-wise, and now that room is in my book that I'm currently querying. So yeah, it all worked out in the end, and I'm really happy with it. So for you, when you're developing your setting, really think about what things do I need to describe and what things aren't as important. What things will help the reader see this room better and what things will be extraneous. And more importantly, what things in this room will tell the reader more about the people who inhabit this room. Now sometimes it'll be a bedroom that'll tell you a lot about one specific character. Sometimes it'll be a classroom which could maybe tell you more about, you know, the type of class that's being taught, or more about the teacher who owns the classroom. Or sometimes it will be a great big huge space in which you need to think about how you can relate to the reader, like what kinds of people inhabit this huge space. If it's a school and it's like a classy boarding school, maybe describe the students who are hanging around the school and like what they look like. You could also describe like the style of the school. Is it Tudor style, or is it more of a Victorian stone building? All of those things will tell the reader more about what to expect from this location. Another thing to think about when it comes to site is the quality of light in a location. Now that's something that usually I think doesn't come naturally to a writer. I don't think a lot of people naturally think like, oh, what is the quality of light in this space? And actually this is something that I learned from another one of my teachers at Columbia, and we used to make fun of her for it. She used to say all the time, what's the quality of light? What's the quality of light? What's the quality of light? And so we'd leave the classroom and be like, what's the quality of light? And we thought it was funny until now I'm constantly thinking when I'm writing out a scene, like, what's the quality of light here? And it really does just add that extra dimension to your scene. Now, sometimes you don't need to include this, you know, sometimes the lighting is just normal, you know, like in my bedroom here. I wouldn't describe the lighting as anything special, but if there is something of note and you can't describe it, that will just add that extra layer of imagery that will really create something dynamic for the reader. If it's really dim in a place, you can describe how dim it is and maybe shadows being cast by any lighting sources that there are. Maybe there's like a single bare bulb in the ceiling and think about how that changes the lighting, or if the sun is setting, how that affects things in the location. I don't know, just something to consider. I personally think that thinking about the quality of light in all of my scenes really does add just that extra layer that I really enjoy having in my books. So then moving on, let's talk about another sense. Let's talk about smell. A really cool tip that I learned from my teachers at Columbia is to think about if maybe there are two contrasting smells. So maybe there's a good smell in this place and there's a bad smell in this place, or there's a savory smell and a sweet smell. Just things that can take this setting from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional, or maybe even 4-dimensional. So for example, in the book I'm currently querying, there is a scene where a character comes into a party and immediately he is struck by these contrasting smells of perfumes and cologne in the air from all of the partygoers, mixing with the smell of BO and alcohol. And like, I'm sure you can imagine what that might smell like. Even if you've never been to a party in your life, like you can picture what that might smell like. And not only does that create like some good imagery for the reader, but also it helps with the character's sense of being overwhelmed. Because my main character is new to town, so he's walking into this party and he doesn't know a single person here other than his sister who he's arriving with. And so being assaulted by all of these different smells sends him into like sensory overdrive, and it makes him feel overwhelmed. And so that adds not only to the setting, but to what the character himself is going through. Now, sometimes there will only be one smell, or sometimes there won't be any smells at all. You know, you just kind of have to think about each individual setting in each individual scene as well, and consider if there are any smells. And that's the thing about all of this as well, is you're probably never going to have all 5 senses going at once, or your description will probably get a little overdone. You just need to kind of pick and choose which senses will best create a full image in the reader's head of your location. So yeah, there could just be one main smell, like maybe the smell of baking bread, or the smell of somebody's really strong perfume, or sometimes, you know, a person's just in their own house, and like right now, I don't smell anything. I'm just in my room and it smells like nothing. So just take the time to think about if there's any smells that could make the setting more dynamic. But if there's not naturally anything that you can think of, then you probably don't need to add it in there. Okay, so now let's talk about sound. And the tip I have for this one is kind of the same as the tip I had for smell, which is 2 sounds, but in this case it's a near sound and a distant sound. So for example, I'm in my bedroom right now and just listening to what's going on around me. A near sound I can hear is my dog right there in the bed snoring, and a far sound I can hear is a car going by on the road outside of my house. And so when you include something like that, a near sound and a distant sound, you, again, create more of a 3 or 4 dimensional location for your reader. You know, it makes it so that the immediate location does not feel like a TV set where it's just that location and there's nothing outside of it. It feels like there is a world beyond what we're experiencing right now. And again, sometimes in a situation it doesn't make sense to focus on sounds, or there just simply isn't a distant sound, like now there isn't a car driving by on the road. But just really think about it and really take the time to honestly consider if there are sounds or not. Like even in a cafeteria scene, you know, you have the sound of somebody chewing like right by your character, and then there's the din of voices in the background. That counts as a near and distant sound. And then maybe even outside of the school you hear a train horn going by, and maybe that'll tell you something about the town that these characters live in or something. So, you know, just consider. Then, for our 4th sense, let's discuss touch. Now, depending on how you're thinking about this whole imagery thing, touch may or may not seem like something easy to include, because sometimes people feel like imagery has to be done by stopping the character in their tracks and just taking in the room, and then they can go on with their day. But that's not necessarily the case. You do not need to stop the character and take in the room and then go forward. Sometimes, and I'd argue a lot of the time, you should be having the character describe the room little by little, interspersed with action and dialogue. So maybe when a character walks into a room, there's some things that they notice immediately, especially if they've never been in this room before. Maybe there's no windows. That would stand out to somebody. Or maybe there's a certain amount of desks if it's a classroom, and maybe that might stand out to somebody, especially if it's like a weird number of desks or the desks are arranged in a strange way. But there might be some things that would only be noticed once the character's interacting with the location. Say they sit down on a bench and then they notice that the bench is cold. That's something they wouldn't have known before they sat down on the bench. Or maybe the character lays down in the grass and then they can feel that the grass is cool and soft. And honestly, this is something to think about with all of the senses, how they can interact, because you don't want to go, okay, what I see. Okay, now what I hear. Okay, now what I smell. Like, you don't want to go individually. You want them to interact. So maybe the character picks up a loaf of bread and feels it, and then the smell of the bread wafts into their nose or something. You know, like, there's always instances that you can take advantage of where the senses can interact, and that just creates an even more dynamic setting. Also, another touch-related thing to keep in mind is temperature of a location. Especially try to think about that when it comes to weather. For example, in the book I'm querying, when that character enters the party, he's going into the house from a hot summer night, but then he notes that it's even hotter inside of the house because of all the bodies jam-packed in there together, and that adds to a sensory overload as well. So yeah, just something to think about. I keep saying that, just something to think about, because I don't want you to think that you have to include every single one of these things into your scene. Like I said, that just won't work. It'll be too much probably. But yeah, I think it's always worth considering every single one of these senses when you're writing a scene to know if you should include them or not. And then finally, let's talk about taste. Now this is the one that you're probably going to end up using the least. I know that I barely, if at all, use taste, but sometimes it can add dimension to your setting just depending on the situation. For example, if your character is in the middle of the desert and wind keeps blowing sand into their mouth, not only will they feel the gritty sand on their skin, but they will taste the grit of the sand, and that will definitely paint a picture for your reader. Or if they're on the ocean and salt water splashes up and it lands on their tongue. That's another example of where it would be great to include taste. Or I offer you the concept of a smell being so overpowering that you can almost taste it. Have you ever had that happen to you? Sometimes it's great. Like you smell fresh baked cookies and you're like, oh, I can practically taste those cookies just from how good they smell. But sometimes it's not so good. Sometimes, you know, somebody's BO is so frickin' rank that you can almost taste it and it's disgusting. That's also something that you could include depending on the situation of your location and the scene itself. And yeah, honestly, I think taste is the best one to include if you can, just because it's so rare that an instance where you can taste something just adds so much. But unfortunately, like I said, it's very rare. You're not gonna like have a character walk into a classroom and like pick up something and like put their tongue on it. But, you know, sometimes, possibly, it could be useful. So yeah, those are my tips and tricks for writing great dynamic imagery of a setting or location. And just remember, even if you are like me and imagery really doesn't come naturally to you, as long as you just stop and think about these things when you're writing your scenes, you'll have good imagery in your books. And you don't even have to stop and think about them when you're on a roll with your writing. This is something that you can go back and think about later when you're revising your book. That's what I do a lot of the time. I've gotten better at including imagery in my 0 and first drafts, but sometimes there are scenes that I just got so into the action that I forgot to describe certain things and I have to go back. And that's not a bad thing, you know? Nobody is gonna read your first, second, third, fourth drafts and judge you for it. It's the final product that really matters. But yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Also, a friendly reminder, I do have a Patreon. It has one single tier, the $1 or more tier, where you can get a lot of really cool perks just for donating $1 a month. So if you are interested in checking that out, the link will be in the description down below. And finally, I hope you have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Bye!